if the MOD line is correct, which is that a British warship, at the same time as a football match between England and Argentina, conducted what is called an innocent passage through waters of the country with which we have the most significant territorial dispute over something that is 5,000 miles away and really difficult to defend, I don't think that was a particularly clever move. If the Argentinians got ashore and then started putting their own drones in there, and everything else, then suddenly it becomes a very different kind of kettle of fish.
Argentina claims HMS Medway made an illegal military incursion into their waters. The Ministry of Defence says it was a standard innocent passage. So, Peter, who was telling the truth here, and was the UK trying to send a deliberate message?
Yes, you are allowed to conduct innocent passage through another country's waters, but that also applies to the waters off the Falkland Islands. And it is not in Britain's interest to encourage the Argentinian Navy to sail around the South Atlantic while conducting innocent passage and man overboard drills within sight of the Falkland Islands. Because, at the risk of stating the bleeding obvious, we can only do that in Argentinian waters very occasionally. They could do it all the time if they wanted. And if they did, that would make... So, for example, the Chinese Navy spends quite a lot of time sitting in international waters off Taiwan. They are perfectly entitled to do so under international law. They're not blockading Taiwan. They're just saying that they might. And that is a perfectly legitimate thing for a Navy to do. It is also perfectly legitimate for the Argentinian Navy to keep warships just outside the territorial waters of the Falklands for the rest of time, while harassing every ship and aircraft that comes and goes with sort of, slightly spurious warnings of missile drills. It does not feel very clever to me to sort of invite that. And I think it may, it depends where the decision was made. I think it's incredibly unlikely that Keir Starmer in his last 48 hours in office went, poke the Argentinians. I definitely want to poke the Argentinians. He doesn't strike me as being that kind of man, although he is an incredibly competitive international lawyer and he's done nothing illegal. So it's not totally impossible. It would be slightly strange. I think the most likely scenario is that the straightest point way between 2 points is a straight line. If you're conducting port visits in Latin America, and Britain has a very long-lasting relationship with Chile, it might make sense to go from A to B. I think it might also have made sense to, not do that. And possibly no one up or down the chain of command thought to raise this with someone more senior is something I think is possible, because I think it probably is, and MOD is probably right to assert this, an innocent passage. But you can do all kinds of innocent stuff, and it's escalatory. Britain has a perfect right to arm Ukraine, so does the US, so does Germany. But we shouldn't be shy about, we have to acknowledge that those decisions come with consequences. And in the case of the UK arming Ukraine, it now appears the Russians set light to Keir Starmer's front door of his house in Kentish Town to send a message to the Prime Minister saying, we could just have killed your family because they're staying there. I think his sister-in-law is renting the place. You are using, that was essentially a Russian message saying you're using Storm Shadow to kill Russian generals. We could put Novichok on your doorstep and your sister-in-law and family will die. We didn't do that. We just sent a 16-year-old to set fire to it. Everyone does this sort of thing. It's sometimes the right thing to do. I think arming Ukraine has probably been the right thing to do, but it comes with consequences. Sending a ship through Argentinian waters at a time where, if Argentina was able to persuade the Chinese to back them in particular to try and take the Falklands back, the British military is already grotesquely overstretched. Probably not so clever, probably won't have those consequences, probably will mean a few more Argentinian fishing boats conduct their own innocent passage around the Falkland Islands. I think it's probably something I wouldn't have done if I was Prime Minister, because the world is already very complicated, and I probably wouldn't have done it.
Argentina's vice president has called England pirates, and players held up banners after the match. Is this just political theatre, or are we starting to see some serious signs of escalation?
So, I mean, I think it's a sort of less dangerous version of what's happening with Taiwan, right? So there is no question that everyone in charge in China and everyone who's conceivably going to be in charge in China for the next X number of years, including the AI algorithms they'll use to run bits of their military, wants to control Taiwan. And the question is whether at some stage they're prepared to take really serious, dangerous action to make that happen. And the answer to that might be yes or no, and they will almost certainly try and use political means to get Taiwan back into sort of the Chinese orbit. I think you could probably say the same of every conceivable Argentinian government over the coming century. I mean, there's also, I think, an argument that I'm sure the Argentinians say, which is that, when everyone who remembers the Falklands War is dead in Britain, the Falklands will feel less important, right? They knew they weren't, they tried to get it in the 80s by military force. They failed because primarily the British had quite a large fleet that was designed to fight a battle of the North Atlantic against the irony is, Russia built up a large navy in the 70s. The Royal Navy was therefore larger than it would have been otherwise, and it just about had the force to get down to the Falklands, to take the Falklands back. Fairly clearly, once that had happened, the Brits were going to be pretty punchy in their defence of the Falklands for the following 25, 30 years. We put fighters down there, we send warships down there. But equally predictably, that level of commitment is likely to dial back, 10, 15, 20% every decade. Having said that, the Spanish have been playing this game with the Rock of Gibraltar for 250 years, and they probably still will be in another 250, because I don't think we're going to give the Rock back to Spain, and I don't think the Americans would let us. They would rather, everyone likes having that kind of base on the Rock. I think wars are very uncommon in Latin America. It is incredibly rare that Latin American countries go to war with each other over disputed borders. And therefore, in fact, I think probably the last Latin American country that seriously went to war would be Argentina over the Falklands. And they lost and the government fell. So I think the odds of a bit of adventurism is quite low. I think the odds of an Argentinian football team unveiling something that says the Malvinas are ours every time they beat a British team is high. And I think in the event of a major global conflict, which I still think is not that likely, maybe sort of 30%, an overstretched Britain that was also fighting in Europe might wake up and discover it had lost the Falkland Islands to an Argentina that had done a deal with somebody else. Although I think the Americans would be incredibly hostile to that. So if you look at the American grand strategy, it is to keep the Chinese at bay in Latin America. And I think the Americans would be incredibly opposed to what I suppose is the most single dangerous option, which is a Chinese-backed Argentinian move against the Falklands. Not so much because they care who owns the Falklands, but because having a Chinese proxy in Argentina would be regarded as being bad news by the US.
So the Argentinian president, Javier Milei, says they're making enormous progress in forcing the UK to the negotiation table over the Falklands. Do you think there's any truth in this?
I mean, I think possibly is the simple answer, but probably not. And the reason for that is British politics. So if you look at the Chagos Islands, sort of giving that has been unpopular, but no one really thinks it's going to be almost the government live or die. I think unless the Argentinians could just buy it. If Britain had a major balance of payments crisis or something, and we were being pressured over it, a much more likely scenario would be if, for example, we'd ever got to the point where large oil deposits were found simultaneously in the Falkland Islands and Argentina's exclusive economic zone, and they were being exploited, then I think there is an environment. There are two ways that could happen. One would be in competition, one would be in collaboration, and they'd probably both happen at once. It's incredibly difficult to do that in the South Atlantic. The South Atlantic is one of the most hostile environments known to man. It is very difficult to imagine that sort of thing happening in quite the same sort of way, although it's not unthinkable as technology gets better. I think the most likely scenario is that we end up where we were. I think a big dependent will be what happens to the population of the Falklands over time. If it starts to diminish and go down to sort of towards zero, then that will sort of the Argentinians will draw conclusions from that. In the short term, though, there's probably just enough people to stay there. It doesn't break the back of the British military to have some Typhoon fighters down there and sort of enough soldiers to be able to put up some defence. As drones become more capable, the same drones that we'll probably put in Estonia, we could put in the Falklands. That would make it incredibly difficult to mount an invasion without enormous risk. I mean, I think where we're heading in the 21st century is that invasions get harder and they often fail, right? And even when they succeed, the US invasion of Iraq is a good example of one that succeeded. Didn't feel that great afterwards. So I don't think the US invasion of Iraq is regarded as a success, even though it happened quite quickly. So I think relatively unlikely. Probably even less likely than a Chinese move against Taiwan. Although if China does move against Taiwan, then it might be game on everywhere, and Britain might wake up to discover it lost a carrier in the Arctic, a battle group in Estonia, and a Chinese flag was flying over Port Stanley alongside an Argentinian one. But I think everyone is quite desperate to avoid that war, and unless it happens, I think and if that happened, I don't think Britain would have the spare resources to defend the Falkland Islands.
In 1982, Britain sent a massive task force to reclaim the islands. If a conflict broke out tomorrow, does the UK and the Royal Navy have the amount of ships and the manpower and the resources it needs to defend the Falklands?
It definitely has enough to defend the Falklands. The question was whether it has enough to attack the Falklands. So if you think about what if you think about what happened in 1982, like I said, Britain had a larger navy because it was preparing to fight the Russians, but it had very, very few troops on the Falklands itself, and it had pulled out its various ships. The simple truth is that a single British warship and a battalion of serious troops, paras or marines or whatever, could probably have held the Falklands against Argentina when it landed. There was basically almost no resistance. That dynamic is now reversed today. So you could actually defend the Falklands against an attack, and the Argentinians might well lose their ships, for example. And again, as I said, if that threat became realer, and UK MOD decided it was going to put some of these drones down there, that it would be much more defensible. Having said that, if the Argentinians got ashore and then started putting their own drones in there, and everything else, then suddenly it becomes a very different kind of kettle of fish. We do have to. I mean, we still have. One of the reasons that the Royal Navy wanted to build the carriers is that they're quite useful. They felt they'd be quite useful for sort of arms fairs and diplomacy and backing up the Americans. And it also gives you a very powerful bunch of ships that can go down, to the South Atlantic if you need to. Same issue as the First Falklands War. You'd have to defend those carriers. That's more difficult in the current era. And it's in the First Falklands War. If you lose a carrier, you lose the war. We don't have many escorts, which means it's a lot more likely to lose a carrier. We would have to find ways of getting other troops down there. But the world has changed quite a lot. So in the First Falklands War, all of the troops went down by ship, right? And they sat in ships off the Falkland Islands for weeks, waiting for the landings to take place. I don't think that's the way you do it these days. I think you'd almost certainly send a much smaller force. You'd try and seize the runway with special forces, and then a bunch of A400Ms would fly the parachute regiment in, without that parachute regiment having to sit on ships for the entire time. I think the world has sort of changed, and I think you would probably conduct the entire conflict in a different way. Fundamentally, I think it's going. As I said, I stick to my earlier comment. It is getting harder and harder to attack things. That makes it easier for us to defend the Falklands. But by the same token, if we were to lose them, going back the other way would not be devoid of challenge.
So while the West is heavily distracted by Ukraine, the Middle East, and tensions in Taiwan, are we going to see more nations like Argentina testing our limits and pushing our territorial claims?
I mean, there aren't that many, is the first point to make. So I don't think there are any other colonial era disputes in Latin America that are particularly big. So, I mean, maybe the Dutch might find someone who wants one of their islands back. Both the Dutch and the French have quite a lot of possessions. I think in most cases, though, they are quite well baked into sort of existing defense agreements. So, for example, the French have quite a lot of possessions in the Pacific, and there's no doubt that both the Russians and the Chinese have been stirring up trouble in French Caledonia, which is about 3 hours flying time from Sydney. So that's definitely happening. The Chinese are definitely sort of pushing their luck in the Pacific in general. But and I think the Pacific is a really interesting, is the field you want to look at for this. The Chinese just launched a ballistic missile into the waters of the Pacific off, I think, Tuvalu, without asking permission from any of the countries whose exclusive economic zone it is. That seems to have pushed Pacific countries even more towards an Australia-based defence strategy. Australia just signed a defence deal with Fiji. So what you're seeing essentially is the Aussies, the New Zealanders, the Filipinos, the Japanese, and the South Koreans sort of starting to do more arrangements between themselves in conjunction with and separate to the Americans. And that's because they're worried about China not just looking to expand there. But that is very much a China-shaped dynamic. In Europe, you're absolutely going to see Russia sort of nudging around its edges. There are other places like Nagorno-Karabakh and so forth where there are sort of frozen conflicts, but it looks as though Armenia has accepted that it's lost Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan. There is still a very live confrontation between India and Pakistan, both over territory in the Himalayas and other things. We had a 4-day war last year. No one thinks that's going to be the last. So, I mean, I think people will push each other's limits, and it's not just about territory. So, if you look at Ukraine and Poland, so on the surface, two countries that are very closely aligned in their desperation to deter Russia, they managed to have a magnificent little spat this year over the I forget what exactly started, but over I can't remember whether it was Ukraine or Poland did this first, but by basically doing a bit too much veneration of wartime units that had killed each other's people. So no territorial posturing. The two countries will probably work together to do all kinds of things like build Freya, which is the new air defense missile for Europe. But they still managed to have a fantastically, angry spat with each other through pushing each other's luck, because they have governments that that contain right-wing elements that view antagonizing Polish or Ukrainian people as one of the things that you do if you're a Ukrainian or a Polish person. I mean, there's not dissimilar. I mean, there are similar set of elements in British society to France. So I think a lot of this takes place in those kind of sort of dynamics.